Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight on Wall Street Wrap-Up, the Consumer Price Index numbers were released this week for August. And not only was it higher than expected, the stock market wasn't happy with what they heard. And there was freight fright this week when FedEx's CEO said we'll be going into a worldwide recession, tanking FedEx stock to its largest drop since its IPO in 1978. And stocks sank as Wall Street showed their displeasure with the higher surprise of higher inflation numbers and the FedEx's dire predictions. And we'll also be talking with August CPI numbers and the hiring of an additional 87,000 new IRS agents, along with the newly signed Inflation Reduction Act with economist Joel Griffith of the Heritage Foundation. I'm Andre Laborde. It's Friday, and that means it's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, I'm Andre Laborde. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up on this Friday, September the 16th, 2022. Hope your week went well. Well, this week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics let Americans get back to work and settle in on Monday before they announced the next day the results for the August CPI results. Economists, including the White House, was hoping that inflation from July had decreased by 0.1%, but when it actually increased by 0.1%. And for the year over year, since August of 2021, inflation is now at 8.3%, higher than economists had predicted and expected. Well, in addition to the CPI, also was released was the August core CPI that excludes both food and energy. And, well, August core CPI was still higher than expected with the year-over-year inflation numbers for August at 6.3%. Now, to put these numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to use when going to the grocery, eggs are up almost 40%. Coffee is up over 17.5%. Milk up 17%. Fish over 8.5%. Meat is over 6.5%. And the cost of energy since August of last year has risen over 23.5%. Shelter rent is up over 6% over the last 12 months. New vehicles rose 10%. And airfares, well, they've taken off almost 33.5%. Well, how did the markets do this week? All S&P 500 sectors ended in the red for the week, and the S&P had its worst week since June of this year. All 11 S&P sectors ended lower for the week as well. Nearly two-thirds of the Dow Jones stocks closed lower today. And this week, the Dow Jones ended at 30,822, which was down 4.1% for the week. The S&P 500, they closed at 3,873, which was down 4.8% for the week. The NASDAQ ended at 11,448, which was almost down 5.5% for the week. And this week, the CEO of FedEx, Federal Express, said we're coming into a worldwide recession. The FedEx CEO said with the slumping demand, they're going to be reducing flight operations and temporarily grounding some of the FedEx aircraft. They'll be also reducing worker hours and consolidating certain sorting operations, and they'll also close 90 FedEx locations. Well, let's get to our guest this evening to help sort out these numbers and just what will it mean to all of us. Joel Griffith is an economist with the Heritage Foundation, and he's here with us tonight. Hi, Joel. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Hey, really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics recently came out with new job numbers, and for last month, we picked up about 315,000 jobs. And they called it like Goldilocks because it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, and they're worried about the Federal Reserve with the raising of interest rates. But I'm curious, if we start adding more jobs for next month, do you think that the Federal Reserve will have to start raising interest rates even more?
I'm thrilled that 300,000 people found a job last month, but we still have nearly 3 million people that have just disappeared out of the labor force over the past 2.5 years. If you look at the percentage of the working age population that is working today versus working 2.5 years ago, it is substantially lower. There are millions of individuals, particularly younger individuals, who simply have not returned to work. And I think we're all experiencing the results of that. If you go to a restaurant, go to a bar, go to a store, you realize that the service has really deteriorated relative to pre-pandemic. Well, that's because people have disappeared. And I know so many people are celebrating this very low unemployment rate of 3.6%. But we got to remember that unemployment rate only measures those people who aren't working, who are actually looking for work. Once you choose to no longer look for work, or once you become so discouraged that you're no longer looking for work, you no longer count as unemployed.
In that same report that came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they said the labor force participation rate was at 62.4%. 38% of the public, unless you're living in the basement with your parents, why do you have that 38% disconnect?
No, you have nailed it. That's a lot of people. That's more than 1 in 3 people who are working age who are not working today. And you mentioned folks living at home with their parents. And if you look at polling data or census data, you actually see that today we have near record high numbers of people that are 30-year-olds plus that are living at home. And I don't want to put the blame just on them. But we also have a situation where the economy is not nearly as strong as some are claiming it to be. And if you talk to businesses right now, one of the biggest problems that small business owners are reporting is that they can't find labor. And often you have businesses that are really competing with the government. Government is paying people not to work in the form of very generous benefits, whether it's housing or food or healthcare subsidies. In effect, you have the government paying people not to work. You have businesses that are trying to find people to work for them at a time when prices are rising at near record high levels. It puts businesses in a really tough spot.
COVID stimulus money that was so plentiful for the last 2 years or so, are people, do you think, still living on that and trying to deplete that before they go out to look for work?
Well, we know that early on, that certainly was a problem. You had about 2/3 of all people who lost their jobs actually found that they could earn more off the job than on the job. And for quite some time, that incentivized people to not even look for work. And people did stockpile those savings. If you look at the numbers coming out of the Census Bureau, we had household savings rates near all-time highs. Close to 23%. Now, over time, that number has come down as people draw down on those savings. And what we see right now is actually quite frightening. If you look at credit card debt is exploding right now because people are finding that their expenses are exceeding their income. And to go back to the jobs numbers, if you look at the jobs numbers from a month ago and you had this big 500,000 headline number, if you go a little dig a little deeper on that, you find that the number of full-time jobs actually was shrinking, meaning that a lot of people were trying to work 2 jobs just to make ends meet.
And the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, just recently signed a bill that restaurateurs will be paying $22 an hour for labor. Well, the ones that really get hit with this will be the franchisees. Right now, their margins are just not that big. So is this sort of like what you're talking about?
I got a soft spot in my heart for Orange County, where I used to live. And if you see what they went through the last 2 years, when the governor and these county commissioners and county sheriffs often were making it criminal for these businesses to even operate during the pandemic, a lot of them went under. And now you have this new minimum wage that's been passed, is going to force restaurants to pay workers $22 an hour, more than double, nearly triple the federal minimum wage. That is going to force a lot of these businesses to go under. It's going to force other restaurants to raise their prices, which of course impacts the middle class. And thirdly, I want to think about those that are actually starting to learn valuable skill sets. A lot of folks in the restaurant industry, you work for a year and a half. I've done it as well when I was in college. You earn minimum wage for a while. You learn valuable skills on the job, including showing up to work on time, working with other people. You gain a skill set that you actually cannot fully learn in college. And what you see when you pass a $22 an hour minimum wage, you are chopping that first rung off the economic ladder for these individuals. And there's academic study after academic study that show it's not just businesses that are hurt. When you put in place a $22 minimum wage, you actually hurt the very people that you're trying to help.
Because of something like this, that you'll see a lot more kiosks. Yeah, instead of giving your order to a human being, you'll be giving it to a kiosk, and then automation will start to be taking over rather than a human being?
That's happening right now. I probably frequent McDonald's a little too often on some of my trips. And the automation at the McDonald's, not just at the airports, but also I was in Arlington, Virginia the other day, and the McDonald's there almost fully automated at this point. Same is holding true actually with the number of bars where you have pour your own tap. That's not just a lot of fun, it's also a cost-saving mechanism. And there's nothing wrong with automation. Automation happens naturally. It allows us all to become more productive. But when you have the government forcing businesses to prematurely automate, it knocks a lot of them out of business. It also directs resources into automation in those particular industries that would have been spent in other industries, helping them to automate. It's all around a loser. And then, of course, you end up with a number of individuals that end up not being able to find work. And it's not because of the automation. The automation just makes it possible for some of these businesses to stay in business. You end up with a lot of people just flat out aren't able to get that first job.
Just recently, Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is now known as OPEC Plus, they started saying how they're going to be decreasing oil coming globally by 100,000 barrels per day. I'm curious your thoughts on whether or not, how will this affect the United States? And I know the 100,000 barrels will be globally, but still we've reduced our drilling in the United States.
Well, the decision by Saudi Arabia and OPEC to reduce their monthly production, that really reflects the reality that demand for oil over the last few months has actually gone down substantially. I was looking at some data from our own Energy Information Administration the other day, and it showed that gasoline demand in the United States is actually about 10% lower than it was last year. So we saw prices have fallen by around 40% since early or mid-February. Sadly, prices are falling for the wrong reasons. Prices are falling because demand is down rather than from increased supply. So this should be a warning to us. And at the very same time that we see our allies in Western Europe and places like Germany that are having their livelihoods and their economies on the rocks because Russia is withdrawing energy from them right now, this should be a warning to us to actually amp up our own productive capacity. And sadly, this administration has put a lot of federal land off limits, and they're really sending warning signals to industry saying that long term, despite the pleas right now that we're begging, even the Biden administration is begging oil producers to produce more right now, they're sending a long-term signal that they want to put fossil fuel companies out of business. And for these companies that plan 5, 10, 20 years in advance as they spend billions of dollars to explore and to drill and develop new technology, when you're telling these companies that 10 years from now, you no longer want them to be in business, it deters them from making investments now that will help secure our future a decade from now.
There is the least amount of oil leases leased to oil companies now since the Harry Truman presidency. And Harry Truman left office in 1952, and that was before oil and gas offshore, this is offshore, was even started. And by the way, that was also before the U.S. government were assigning oil and gas offshore leases.
Yeah, if you think about our natural gas industry and the fact that we have abundant resources right now of natural gas, and even though the prices are up in that sector, if you look at what's happening in Europe, it is far, far worse. You've got natural gas prices that are up in some areas 1,000% over the past year. And that needs to be a warning to us that if we repeat the mistakes of Europe, it means higher energy costs, but it also means in some places, the government is saying it might be 95 degrees outside, but you've got to keep your thermostat at 80. Or in places like, I think it was Spain, they're saying that over the winter, you're not going to be allowed to set your thermostat past 60-something degrees. That's the type of quality of life decline that we can anticipate in the United States if we continue to model our future energy policy after what has been going on in Western Europe over the past 20 years.
Vladimir Putin has now stopped any and all natural gas from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, of course, he's saying it is because of maintenance problems, but I think almost everybody knows that's just totally not true. We're going into the winter. And of course, the European winters are much, in certain parts of Europe, are so much stronger. If this becomes a cold winter, do you think that the manufacturing will also be slowing down, which will then also hurt the United States?
Oh, without a doubt, because it's not just electricity. It's not that it just allows us to cook and heat and cool our homes. It's a vital source for manufacturing a sector. And if you look at in Germany, now these are older numbers now because energy costs are so much higher. But in parts of Germany, you would see energy costs are already triple what you see in parts of the United States. In the manufacturing side, it's a big part of the reason why it's very likely that Europe will be heading into recession just as the United States is in a recession. I think a lot of our politicians in the United States are not learning these lessons because we have seen over the years in certain states like Michigan, putting in place these renewable energy mandates that have made it far more expensive for their factories to operate. It's a big part of the reason why we've seen a migration of factories from places like Michigan to places down south where they have more affordable energy. Well, those states benefited from that affordable energy. And it's just, I think, unfortunate that you see so many politicians abroad and here in the United States really kneecapping the ability of our factories to actually produce more.
Well, you talked about Michigan, or I'll bring up California that has a mandatory no more gas-powered, fossil fuel-driven combustible engine cars sold after, I want to say 2035. They're going to have to, I'm assuming, put that back or have a waiver, won't they? I mean, unless right now there's stresses on the power grid of California now, and there's rolling blackouts in 2022. Well, 2035 is only 13 years from now.
Well, common sense would seem to demand that they roll back these draconian provisions, but I'm not confident they will. Think back what happened in California over the last year and a half is we had all these supply chain issues. Well, one part of why those supply chain problems were magnified is because California, in the middle of this crisis, the supply chain crisis, actually allowed new legislation to be implemented that took many, many diesel trucks off the roads. They could have put that legislation on pause. It would have taken a simple vote in the California Assembly and Gavin Newsom to sign it into law. And instead, California allowed that legislation to go into effect. Same holds true with the new legislation in California saying they're going to ban these gas vehicles after 2035. They see what's happening in their own states now. We know what's happening in Europe right now with electric vehicles and the fact that really for most people, once that battery goes in your vehicle, people are realizing, wow, that $25,000 Chevy Volt's not looking like such a bargain when you have to pay $20,000 for a new battery. The politicians know this is a problem, but they're catering to their special interest groups and they're allowing these provisions to go into effect.
And Joel is a research fellow and economist at the Heritage Foundation. We're going to take a break, but we'll be right back. If you're just joining us, we're happy to have Joel Griffith with us. He's an economist. Joel, before we left for break, we were talking about the price of oil. We were talking about costs going up. And I'm curious, with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's many hidden taxes in that. And one of the taxes, and we're talking about oil and gas, is that I want to say it's like 16.4 cents per gallon of oil that is being produced in the United States. Well, that's going to have to be either passed on or somebody's going to have to eat that. Do you see that this is going to have to be passed on with higher gasoline taxes?
Oh, all these taxes, and there's multiple new taxes in this legislation. One is increasing royalties on energy that is produced from federal lands, and another is basically a tax on methane emissions, which happens when you produce natural gas. Well, all of that is ultimately borne by both shareholders of the companies, but also by consumers, because these costs are passed on. Now, in the grand scheme of things, this $200-something billion worth of spending is just a tiny fraction of all that's been spent over the past few years. But there's no doubt that this is going to add to inflation because it's doing two things. Number one, we're continuing to suppress supply, and these new taxes will suppress supply of these energy sources. And at the same time, there's a spending component of this legislation that is going to produce demand. When you increase demand and decrease supply, that results in inflation, especially when you end up printing more of the money to actually fund that spending.
You recently wrote a piece I enjoyed, and it was about the IRS. And speaking about the Inflation Reduction Act, part of that act is going to be adding about 87,000 new IRS agents. Well, we're being told that guaranteeing anyone making under $400,000 will not pay 1 penny more than they are now, either in new taxes, nor what they're saying is that with the 87,000 new IRS agents that are going to be added to the Internal Revenue Service, that they're going to be there will be no increase of audits for those making under $400,000. Well, you know, there was an old saying about a bank robber named Willie Sutton, and they asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" He goes, "Well, that's where the money is." Where will be the big money that IRS will have to go to generate the funds used to create the existence of the new 87,000 IRS agents?
Yeah, well, first off, if you look at prior audit data, we know that the majority of audits have actually targeted those with under $75,000 worth of adjusted gross income. That is barely middle class. Number two, if you actually look at the fine print of what Treasury Secretary Yellen said and what the IRS commissioner said, they promised, and this is just a promise, this is not something you can hold them to in a court of law, but we'll go with their word. They promised that relative to recent years, the audit rates will not increase for those earning under $400,000. Well, what do they mean by recent years? I went ahead and actually looked at prior audit rates back in 2010, and you realize something very shocking. Audit rates today for the middle class are around 50% lower than they were in 2010. Audit rates for partnerships, which usually are just a few people working together, audit rates for partnerships today are roughly 75% less than they were in 2010. So if we're going to take them at their word, and if we're going to go ahead and use these new 87,000 agents to return audit levels to where they were in recent years, that means that if you're middle class, that's about a 50% to possibly a doubling of the audit rates. And if you're a partnership, it's a whopping 500% increase in the chance of an audit. And that's taking them at their word. The bottom line is this is truly going to be a shakedown of middle class income earners and small business earners. Past data confirms that. And sadly, I think the future data will confirm it as well.
What about the college debt forgiveness right now that just was passed? And I say passed, that it was basically by executive order that anyone with $10,000, the first $10,000 will be forgiven for individuals and $20,000 for couples. And that's if you're making, for couples, if you're making under $250,000. How will this be? I mean, I've heard stories everywhere that this is going to cost anywhere from $300 billion all the way to almost double and triple the amount, about $800 billion. Do you have any research data on how much something like this is going to be costing?
Well, depending on what these parameters end up being and what gets approved in the courts, it could be closer to $1 trillion in forgiveness. And I don't want to diminish the fact that student loan debt is a big problem. I incurred debt as well when I went to law school, and you see so many students graduating from undergrad, graduating from grad school with this debt load that feels like such a burden, because it is a burden. It's stopping people from being able to start their lives, from getting married, from buying a home. But we got to ask, well, what caused this problem? And this has been colleges working with the federal government to indebt these students is a big part of the reason. All this money that flows from the federal government that allows somebody who's 20 years old to get $100,000 of cash to go ahead and deliver to the university. This is the primary reason why college education has increased at a multiple of the overall inflation rates, because of all of this money pouring in that goes into the hands of tenured professors and these beautiful college campuses. It's a very real problem. But to go ahead now and have the federal government forgive that debt makes matters even worse. It's going to stoke inflation, because now money that would have gone to actually repay the debt that people owed is going to be injected into the economy, raising prices even more, primarily for the middle class. And this is going to incur what we call moral hazard. It's going to encourage colleges and universities to increase their tuition more, and it's going to incentivize new students to take on even more debt with the hopes that a future president will forgive that debt as well. The people that lose, it's not just the taxpayers. It's also people that aren't even paying taxes because the cost of living is going to rise through even more inflation, which truly is a hidden tax. Because look, we know that half the population, half of income earners actually don't pay an income tax, but that doesn't mean that they don't end up paying for this awful mismanagement of our economy. They pay for it with fewer opportunities, lower wages, and higher prices.
Joel, I have to end it there, my friend. I hope you come back. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Joel. Well, if you have a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. Make it pithy, make it concise, and write us at Andre@WallStreetWrapUp.info. And now for a look ahead for market information for next week. But first, William Durant, a maker of wooden wagons and buggies, incorporated what business on this day in 1908? Well, we'll have that answer in just a moment. Well, William Durant, a maker of wooden wagons and buggies, incorporated what business on this day in 1908? General Motors. And seeing his business of wagons and buggies will be extinct with the automobile, he decided to join in with his first of many automobiles in GM, the Buick. Well, with stocks selling off this week, some of the biggest names in technology got hit the hardest. From the 52-week high, some of those that dropped the most included Microsoft, dropped $672 billion. Meta Platforms, which was called Facebook, formerly Facebook, dropped $643 billion. Amazon dropped $573 billion. Apple has dropped over $470 billion. And Alphabet, or Google, they're down over $460 billion from their 52-week high. And next week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, we're going to be talking with the senior editor of Forbes magazine, Dan Alexander. We'll be talking about his latest article in the new Forbes about Donald Trump's net worth and the latest value of his real estate empire. Is it really higher or lower? And we'll also ask him about some other articles in Forbes and also the annual Richest 400 edition. We'll find out, who's on the list and who's not. That's next week. Dan Alexander, senior editor at Forbes magazine. Well, as a reminder, we repeat the show on Sunday mornings, but the best way is to set your DVR so you'll never miss an episode. And that's our show. For this Friday, September the 16th, 2022, I hope you enjoyed it. My thanks so much to Joel Griffith for joining us this evening. But as always, it's you. We appreciate you for allowing us into your homes tonight. So remember, follow us on all the social media, on Facebook, on YouTube and Twitter, and WYES.org. So enjoy your weekend. Have a productive week as well. I'll see you next week. Remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde. Remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.